how a 14-year-old assassin ended a dynasty. The boy was born into silence. No horns blared for his arrival. No royal scribes etched his name into marble. He did not arrive wrapped in silk or even in safety. He was born behind the walls of a crumbling servant's house, far from the eyes of the court, but dangerously close to its whispers. His mother, once a favored maid in the palace of the Han Dynasty, had been discarded after a scandal that was never written down. Some said she had seen something. Others claimed she had touched someone she shouldn't have. What mattered more was what she left the world with, a son, a boy no one wanted, a boy no one named. And so for the first years of his life, he was called nothing, just the child. But even nameless, he watched. He remembered. He grew. It was a dangerous time to grow up in the shadow of power. The Han Dynasty was crumbling beneath its own weight. Corruption had become tradition. Generals controlled emperors. Eunuchs controlled generals. And the emperor, a boy himself, had no control at all. The court reeked of wine and lies. Ministers vanished overnight. Assassins were a tool, not a scandal. And in the midst of it all, the boy, barefoot, hungry, forgotten, learned how to listen. He became a shadow in silk corridors. He learned which guards drank too much, which maids whispered names in their sleep. He learned to read, not with scrolls, but with eyes. He read fear, ambition, lust, and above all, he read the weakness of men who thought themselves untouchable. By the age of 10, the boy had a name, but it wasn't his own. He had given himself one J, simple, quick, forgettable. That's how he liked it. Names were like blades, too much ornament, and they became useless in a real fight. G didn't fight with swords, not yet, but he fought with silence, with memory, with perfect timing. At 11, he discovered the secret passage beneath the northern garden that led directly into the servants' quarters of the chief minister. At 12, he followed a royal guard for 4 days and discovered the hidden rendezvous between the emperor's advisor and the same warlord who had once tried to claim the throne. At 13, G met someone who would change everything. A man named Wei, a disgraced strategist once praised as the mind behind the last major Han military victory. He had been banished after one wrong word, but now he lived quietly in exile near the palace grounds, teaching philosophy to whoever had the ears to listen. G didn't want philosophy. He wanted power. Wei gave him both. Under Wei's cold guidance, G learned the ways of dynasties, their rise, their decay, and their fall. He memorized the timelines of emperors who thought they were gods and died like dogs. He understood that a dynasty didn't fall all at once. It rotted from the inside until a single cut made it collapse. And by the time G turned 14, he knew exactly where to make that cut. Not with a blade, but with betrayal, because betrayal, Wei taught him, was not a weapon. It was a key to open the door no one else could. And G was ready to walk through. The target? A man beloved by all, trusted by the emperor, praised by scholars, and honored by the military. Chancellor Liang, a man whose face wore the mask of wisdom, but whose hands were soaked in blood. The man who orchestrated the deaths of Wei's family. The man who had cast out G's mother with a whisper. G didn't hate him. He didn't need to. Hate was loud, and G needed silence. He would become Chancellor Liang's most trusted errand boy. He would serve his tea, fetch his robes, light his incense, and then he would destroy him. Not with a blade, not yet, but with the first whisper of scandal, a single note left in the emperor's chamber, a letter rewritten in Liang's handwriting, a bribe exposed in the wrong hands. It would start slowly, like a crack in porcelain. And G, at just 14 years old, would be the boy who watched the empire tilt toward chaos, with a calmness that terrified even his teacher. because Ji wasn't just trying to kill a man, he was about to end a dynasty. Chancellor Liang was not a man easily rattled. He had weathered storms that would have sunk lesser men, rebellions, betrayals, famines, whispers of war. And when young Ji appeared in his service, bowing low, eyes to the floor, the chancellor barely noticed. Just another nameless errand boy in a palace teeming with them. But Ji didn't need to be noticed, not yet. He began with routine, predictability, always present, always silent. He poured tea precisely to the rim, never spilled, never stared, and it worked. In a palace full of liars and ladder climbers, Chancellor Liang began to trust the boy who asked for nothing. But behind every bow, Ji was building something invisible, a web of moments, details, and leverage. He memorized the patterns, who Liang met with when the palace was asleep, which informants dropped scrolls at his door, what words made his right hand tremble ever so slightly. And then Ji began inserting cracks. The first was small, a sealed scroll replaced with a forged one, identical in wax but carrying a false report, that a northern general, once loyal, had begun corresponding with the rebels. The emperor, still a teenager himself, grew anxious. His court became paranoid, and Chancellor Liang, unaware of the switch, endorsed the contents publicly. The backlash was immediate. The accused general arrived in the capital, scrolls and signatures in hand, demanding justice. It was the first time Liang's word had been openly challenged. But Ji didn't stop. Next came the stolen seal, an impression used on a false order, traced back to a corrupt merchant that Liang had secretly protected. The scandal deepened. The emperor, young but increasingly unsure, summoned his council to investigate. Whispers grew teeth. Eyes that once averted began to follow Liang's every move. Ji wasn't working alone anymore. Wei had returned, not to the palace, but to the conversation. Through secret messengers, scrolls encoded with symbols, and couriers who didn't know they were being used, he helped orchestrate the misinformation war from afar. Together, master and student were unraveling a legend. And then Ji made his boldest move yet. He arranged a secret meeting between a dismissed guard and a foreign envoy. The meeting itself wasn't illegal, but the location, beneath the mausoleum of the emperor's grandfather, was sacred. When word reached the emperor that Liang's errand boy had orchestrated the desecration, Liang panicked, not publicly, not outwardly, but Ji saw it. The hesitation, the break in ritual, the silence that lasted too long. Liang had built his career on the appearance of control, and Ji was ripping it away piece by piece. But it wasn't enough to weaken him. Ji had to break him. So, Ji turned to the Empress. She was barely older than Ji, a girl trained her whole life to play a part in a script she didn't write. But she saw what Ji was doing, and she was tired of being used. Behind silks and smiles, she hated Liang. She hated his control, his surveillance, the way he used her marriage to the emperor as a tool for his own power. Together, they began to rewrite the story. It was the Empress who convinced the emperor to summon Liang without warning. It was Ji who slipped a forged map of rebel troop movements into Liang's case of scrolls. And it was Wei who sent Ji the final script, the speech the emperor would read to strip Liang of his rank before the full court. The trap was set. All Ji had to do was wait, because the cut wasn't coming with a blade. It was coming with a voice, a royal decree born from forged scrolls, secret allies, and a 14-year-old boy who had turned scandal into strategy. And when it fell, it would echo not just through the palace, but through history. Because this wasn't just the end of a man, it was the beginning of the end of a dynasty. It happened at sunrise. The emperor stood in the hall of virtuous harmony, flanked by scribes, guards, and ministers who had learned to listen more than speak. Ji stood in the corner, not as a servant now, but as an observer, still invisible but undeniably present. The Empress watched from the latticework of her private chamber, her eyes locked on the man they were about to unmake. Chancellor Liang arrived late. That in itself was a scandal. He had never been late in 20 years. But this morning, his cloak was wrinkled, his scrolls disordered, and his expression betrayed a storm no one could see but Ji. The Emperor cleared his throat, voice wavering. His hands trembled slightly as he unfurled the scroll. Wei's words stared back at him, disguised as his own. "Chancellor Liang," he began, "you have been our guide, our light, our guardian. But even light casts shadows, and in those shadows we have found questions." Ji's heart didn't race. It slowed, like a hunter watching the prey take its final steps. The accusations followed: falsified reports, unauthorized dealings with foreign envoys, sacred desecrations, and the misplacement of imperial seals. Liang's face did not fall. It cracked. The calm he had worn like a second skin began to peel. Ministers who once nodded at his every word now looked to the Emperor. The tide had turned, and Ji was the moon that moved it. Liang tried to speak, but the Emperor raised a hand. Let the truth finish speaking. And the truth was heavy. Forged documents, hidden witnesses, even a whispered confession from the dismissed guard, who was now safely far from the capital. By the time the Emperor ordered Liang's removal, the court was silent. No one wept, no one protested. The once untouchable man was led away not in chains, but in silence, a silence that screamed louder than any execution. Ji slipped away before the final decree was stamped. In a narrow courtyard behind the Empress's garden, he met Wei. "It's done," Ji said. Wei nodded. "It's begun." Because as Chancellor Liang fell, a vacuum opened. Generals began repositioning. Eunuchs sniffed opportunity. Foreign envoys who once feared Han power now saw a wounded animal. Ji had ended a man. But in doing so, he had broken the spine of a dynasty held together by illusion. And it would not survive the storm that was coming. More ministers would fall, more secrets would spill. The Emperor would soon discover that taking power is easier than holding it, and somewhere in the chaos, Ji would vanish again. Just a shadow, just a whisper, just a child who never should have mattered. But history would remember him. Not for his name, but for the day a 14-year-old boy unseated an empire. The palace was quieter without Chancellor Liang, but it was not at peace. Power, once tightly held in Liang's careful grip, now scattered like shards of glass across the marble floors of the imperial court. Ji could feel it, the tension, the scramble, the predators sniffing blood in the air. But unlike the others, Ji wasn't scrambling for power. He was watching it. The Emperor, young and still naive, believed he had cleansed his court. He walked taller, issued decrees with newfound authority, and summoned generals without waiting for advice. But Ji saw through it. The Emperor wasn't ruling. He was floating, carried by the current Ji had stirred, and that current was beginning to flood. Without Liang, factions emerged. Military leaders began lobbying for influence. Scholar officials tried to assert ancient codes of ethics. The Empress's family suddenly found their voice. Everyone had something to say. Everyone wanted a piece of the vacuum. Ji remained silent, but not still. He returned to the corners, to the gardens, to the underground passages. He followed generals' daughters on their way to secret meetings. He eavesdropped on monks invited to cleanse the court of corruption. He watched scrolls change hands and saw lies take root where truth had barely begun to grow. And then he found it. A letter, not addressed to anyone directly and unsigned, but clearly penned by someone within the palace, someone orchestrating a quiet rebellion. A push to restore not Liang, but a figure like him, a stabilizer, a controller, someone to balance the Emperor's inexperience before foreign threats could pounce. It was a plan to install a new power behind the throne, a shadow regent. Ji knew this couldn't happen. He hadn't destroyed Liang to replace him with another puppet master. He had seen the disease in Power's patterns, and this letter was a symptom of recurrence. So he made a choice, a second betrayal, a deeper cut. He copied the letter by hand, then altered its tone. He added accusations that weren't there, names that hadn't been listed. He included enough truth to make it believable, and enough fiction to make it fatal. He planted the forged version in the study of General Yang, the emperor's most trusted military advisor. The explosion was immediate. General Yang was summoned, stripped of command, and banished before the court could process the full weight of the accusation. Protests were made, but silenced. The emperor, humiliated by the scale of what had been discovered, doubled down. More purges followed, more voices vanished, and he disappeared again. This time, willingly. He left the palace for the mountains carrying nothing but a worn scroll of Sun Tzu's teachings and a pouch of coins no one knew he had. He didn't run. He retired, at 14. But even in the quiet, his name became legend. The boy who ended Chancellor Liang. The ghost behind the fall of General Yang. The whisperer who undid the court. In markets and temples, travelers repeated his story in fragments. Some said he was a demon, others, a divine spirit sent to cleanse the empire. But the truth was more frightening. Ji had no magic, no army, no name etched in marble. He was just a boy who understood power better than the men who held it. And by the time winter arrived, the dynasty he had punctured was bleeding faster than anyone could stop. Because once a crack begins, it doesn't close. It spreads. And Ji, wherever he was, knew it. The winter wind carried whispers through the capital, of betrayal, of vengeance, of a boy who had done what legions could not. Ji had vanished, yet the tremors of his actions echoed louder than the emperor's decrees. Ministers dared not speak his name aloud, but in hushed corners of the court, he had already become myth. But this wasn't a story about myths. This was about the unraveling of a kingdom. The Han Dynasty, once a symbol of heaven's mandate, was crumbling not from rebellion but from doubt. The emperor, boyish, reactive, desperate to prove himself, grew increasingly paranoid. Without Chancellor Liang's counsel and with General Yang disgraced, he leaned into rituals, omens, and old prophecies. Each sunrise felt like a warning, each council meeting a gamble. Power had not returned to the throne, it had fractured. One general raised a private army under the guise of border security. A foreign envoy arrived with tribute but left with classified scrolls. The empress, clever, hardened, calculating, moved quietly through chambers once ruled by men, gathering her own circle of influence. No one ruled anymore. Everyone schemed. And Ji? He watched from afar. A fisherman's hut, nestled in the fog-wrapped highlands, served as his exile. But the boy never stopped listening. Travelers spoke of provinces declaring loyalty to new banners. Merchants whispered of coins stamped with a new seal. And once in spring, a monk passed through bearing a scroll. Its seal broken, its message simple. They're waiting for a shadow to return. Ji did not return. He never would. His story wasn't one of power seized. It was one of power exposed. And in time, as dynasties fell and others rose, as kings became pawns and history rewrote its own face, the legend of Ji, the nameless boy who broke an empire, remained untouchable. Not because he ruled, but because he understood something no emperor ever did. The most dangerous man in the world is the one who doesn't want the throne, only the fall of those who do.